There are people whose very way of facing life tells you that they were not born in the same rhythm as today's generation, not because they are outdated, but because they were shaped in an era where silence was considered a natural instinct and responsibility settled onto their shoulders long before they even knew how to use the word responsibility in its true sense. These are the ones who grew up in the 1970 seconds, carrying within them a psychological structure as dense and heavy as the sediment lying at the bottom of old rivers. Their calmness is not the result of training, but the product of a historical period where emotions had no place to rest. They grew up with very little supervision, very little guidance, and countless situations that forced them to fend for themselves. When a child has to confront the world before it even understands what the world is, it creates a kind of person we later often call steady. They are strong not because they were born strong, but because no one ever gave them the chance to be weak. You can recognize them through the smallest details. The way they always check the door one last time before going to sleep. The way they quietly put things back where they belong. The way they fix a broken object with the patience of someone who didn't grow up with the luxury of replacing things. And sometimes, when someone asks if they're okay, they answer with a faint smile, the kind of smile worn by those long accustomed to carrying the weight of the world without wanting to burden anyone else with it. They do not complain, do not revisit the things that hurt them, do not demand to be understood, not because they are unhurt, but because they witnessed the generation before them. Their parents live entire lives in silence. They believe that silence is the only way to survive. And so, as the years pass, that quietness becomes a shell, then an identity, then a kind of strength they themselves are not entirely sure they ever wished for. That generation exists like a strange boundary between two eras, one half belonging to the slow, rugged years of the past, the other pulled into the hurried pace of the new century. And sometimes, when they watch the world change too quickly, they carry with them a question that is almost whisper quiet. In all of these changes, which version of myself am I now? When we look into the inner life of those who grew up in the 1970 seconds, we begin to see that they do not truly live by personality, but by the mechanisms that childhood quietly programmed into them. A kind of programming no one taught, no one explained, yet it continues to operate within them to this very day, smoothly, persistently, and at times more ruthlessly than they themselves realize. They came of age in a time when every emotion had to travel a long distance before finding a place to rest. Adults were busy earning a living, busy struggling, busy surviving. No one had the time to pause for a child's sadness. In such a world, children learned early that whatever they said, there would rarely be anyone free enough to listen. And when a child learns to swallow rather than express, its brain begins to store silence as a survival mechanism. Emotions, therefore, do not flow outward, but inward, accumulating into layers of sediment even they themselves would not know how to begin unraveling years later. Science might call this the development of self-regulation, but in real life, it is simply the feeling of, no one will do it for me. A lost child must find its own way home. A broken item cannot be replaced, so they must open it up and see what is inside. A fear must be swallowed because even if spoken aloud, the adults would have no time to soothe it. Over the years, these experiences no longer sit on the surface of memory. They sink and form a functional structure. Each time life presents a challenge, something within them instantly switches on. Stand up, handle it, don't complain, don't wait for anyone. But that very mechanism, which once saved them in childhood, becomes a locked door in adulthood. People often admire their steadiness as a noble trait, yet few ever see the cost beneath it. Their brain, in trying to protect the child they once were, has woven an invisible armor. And now, even when the armor is no longer needed, they do not know how to take it off. They are not used to leaning on anyone, so at this age, they no longer know where to place their weight. And sometimes, the feeling of not knowing where to lean is lonelier than having no one at all. A childhood with few stimuli forged them in a quiet terrain rarely experienced by today's generation. They grew accustomed to stillness, to afternoons with nothing to do but watch the world move slowly. That stillness made their minds deep, solid, and less shaken by superficial things. but it also made it difficult for them to recognize their own emotional needs. When you grow up in a place where no one listens, you begin to believe that whatever happens inside you was never meant to matter. Meanwhile, the generation born after 2000 was raised in an entirely different rhythm. Faster, brighter, louder. Information floods the mind like a waterfall, and they must learn to keep running so as not to be left behind. If those of the 70 seconds learn to survive in silence, then those of the new era must learn to survive in noise. One side lacked a guiding hand, the other is overwhelmed by stimulation to the point of exhaustion. And when the two generations stand next to each other, what we see is not just a difference in age, but two types of brains shaped by two different worlds. Two forms of silence facing each other without being able to touch. One silent from overload, the other from having endured too much. And perhaps the most heartbreaking truth lies here. They are not lacking emotion. They are only lacking a place safe enough to set it down. When we look back at the world in which the generation of the 1970 seconds came of age, we begin to see that the divide between eras lies not only in technology or circumstance, but deep within the way society treated its people. In those years, the world moved more slowly, sometimes so slow that an afternoon could feel as long as a memoir. Everything was scarce. Few choices, little noise, few conveniences, but also fewer invisible pressures. People did not have to prove so much to be acknowledged. They only needed to live, to work, to try. Life was like an unpaved road, uneven, dusty, but with so few signposts that people didn't compare their position endlessly to others. That generation grew up in a space where fear was real, danger was real, scarcity was real, yet psychological pressure was rarely named. No one had to worry about being judged by thousands of invisible eyes. There were no hidden leaderboards for happiness, success, capability, or appearance. The society of that time was hard, rough, but also simpler. The price of simplicity was harshness, but the gift of harshness was endurance. And then the world changed its color in just a few decades. If the old world was like a slow-flowing stream, the new world resembles a turbulent sea, constantly crashing against the minds of the young. Those born after 2000 grew up in an environment where everything accelerates. Information, expectations, comparisons, living standards, beauty standards, success standards. A world where fear is not about lacking food or safety, but about lacking value, lacking recognition, lacking a place to stand amid a sea of people moving too fast. And it is here that the tension between the two generations begins to reveal itself. Those from the 70 seconds look at the exhaustion of the young and cannot understand how a life of abundance can drain someone to the bone. Meanwhile, the young look at the silence of the older generation and cannot fathom how one can live an entire life without ever speaking their sorrow aloud. One side is used to confronting physical hardship, the other, emotional hardship. One side endured pain through the body, the other endures pain through the mind. Today's society demands that people constantly express, constantly connect, constantly prove themselves. But those of the 1970 seconds were taught that silence is maturity, independence is virtue, and hiding one's sadness is natural. They carry their deep nature into a world that is becoming shallower, not shallow in intellect, but shallow in emotional pace. This world leaves little room for those who need time to feel, to breathe, to understand themselves. Everything must be fast, explicit, visible, and for a soul accustomed to hiding, such a pace feels like a bright spotlight shining into eyes that have lived too long in dimness. This tension is not anyone's fault. It is simply the product of two different kinds of societies. One society raised people through silence, the other disperses them through noise. One forged strength from within, the other drains them from without. And so the two generations stand before each other not wrong, just profoundly different. Perhaps this is the most beautiful sadness of the generational gap. It is not that they do not love one another, but that they do not look at the world through the same lens. There is a strange paradox that becomes more visible the deeper we look into the lives of these two generations. Those who grew up in the 970 seconds, are among the strongest people we have ever known. Yet they are also the most wounded in ways few have ever imagined. Their strength, viewed from the outside, looks like a gift. But from within, it resembles a quiet reminder of everything they had to endure. And it is precisely at the intersection of strength and hurt that a beauty emerges, one that is difficult to describe, at once admirable and quietly painful. That generation matured in harshness, and so they learned how to face it. But the irony is that such strength does not allow them to live more lightly. It helps them withstand every storm, yet leaves them unsure how to live when the skies are finally clear. They know how to brace themselves in hardship, but they do not know where to lay down their burdens when life becomes calm. They are the kind of people who can stand firm their whole lives. Yet in their stillest moments, they do not know what to lean on, should they ever wish to fall. Here, the greatest paradox begins to reveal itself. What makes them strong is exactly what makes them lonely. What helps them survive life is exactly what distances them from themselves. They built their lives on the invisible rules passed down from an older era. Endure a bit, tolerate a bit, push through a bit more. But when they step into the new world, where emotions are encouraged, where vulnerability is seen as courage, they feel misplaced. They do not know how to speak of the pain that has followed them for decades. They do not know how to say the words, "I'm tired." They do not know how to admit that they were never truly shown gentleness, and therefore have no idea where gentleness is supposed to go now. The generation born after 2000 is the opposite. They grow up in a world where every emotion has a place to be stored, a language to be expressed with, a community to be shared with. Yet because they have too many choices, they do not know what to choose. With so many mirrors to look into, they no longer know which one reflects them truly. They have freedom, but that freedom comes with the fear that anything they do could leave them behind. And so, the two generations stand before one another, like two opposing existential schools of thought. One believes life is something to endure. The other believes life is something to search for meaning in. One builds itself by reducing its needs. The other defines itself by understanding its needs. Neither is wrong, yet neither truly understands the kind of suffering the other is carrying. The tragedy lies here. The strong are exhausted from having been strong for too long. The weak are exhausted because they have not yet learned how to be strong. The old wish to put down their burdens, but do not know where it is safe to do so. The young want to stand firmly, but fear they are not enough. And when we look at these two generations, we see a truth so simple, it becomes cruel. Every human being longs to be seen, yet each era teaches them entirely different ways to hide themselves. That is when inner conflict ceases to be a personal matter. It becomes the existential question of an entire age. Are we truly moving forward, or merely trading one familiar form of suffering for another that feels more bearable? When we reach the twilight of the human psyche, we begin to see a very different terrain, one where analysis and reason can no longer cast light. It is the place where those who grew up in the 1970 seconds often stand alone, quietly, as if they have become more familiar with the long shadow of their own selves than with the hands that wish to reach out and hold them. It is not that they do not long for closeness. It is simply that they have learned, too many times, that closeness does not always stay long enough for someone to lean on it. Their loneliness is not loud. It is not crying, not sharp bursts of pain, but a faint, weary sound that stirs softly whenever night falls. A kind of fatigue they do not know how to name, because it does not belong to any specific event, did not begin on any particular day, and will not end at any particular time. It is like a long breath they have unconsciously held in their chest for decades, until sometimes just a simple question like, "Are you okay?" is enough to make them want to cry, not because they are weak, but because it has been far too long since anyone truly touched the softest part of them. Those of that generation carry with them a strange kind of longing for things they never had, longing for a gentleness life never had the chance to give them, longing for a safety their childhood never knew enough to name. And that longing, however vague, quietly pulls them back to an old emptiness, a place where they once stood by the doorway, looking out at a vast world, unsure whether they belonged anywhere at all. It is the kind of sorrow that needs no reason. It only needs a place to live. Meanwhile, The younger generation carries a different kind of loneliness. Loneliness amid too much noise, too many eyes, too many chances to become someone. They do not face material scarcity, but they face an emotional overload the older generation can hardly imagine. They feel too much, compare too much, fear too much. And the more they try to blend into the world around them, the further they are pushed away from themselves. They are tired from having to constantly be present, while the older generation is tired from never having been allowed to be present in their own way. And so, the two generations stand beside each other like two discordant musical notes. One so low it sinks to the bottom, one so high it shatters when reaching the peak. Both are beautiful, both are aching, and both do not know how to explain their sorrow to the other. Perhaps the deepest tragedy of being human lies here. Everyone carries an untold story, yet no one knows where to bring it. And when we look into the eyes of these two generations, the older ones shaded with dusk, the younger ones bright yet weary, we realize that loneliness spares no one. It merely chooses a different place to reside within each of us. And in that moment, we understand human beings, whether strong or weak, of any time or any world, are ultimately just souls trying to find a place gentle enough to rest. When we reach the farthest edge of the dark regions within human emotion, what awaits us is not despair as we often imagine. Strangely enough, it is precisely in the place where light seems absent that we begin to see the first traces of healing. Just as the eyes must grow accustomed to darkness before they can recognize light, a person must look deeply into their own loneliness before realizing that they were never truly alone. The generation of the 1,970 seconds, after a lifetime of holding themselves together, perhaps never had anyone tell them that they do not have to stay strong forever. And when they slow down, even just a little when they dare to ask themselves a question, they discover a simple truth they were never taught. Gentleness is not a luxury. It is a right they have always had, but never dared to claim. They do not need to do anything more to deserve that softness. They only need to allow themselves to breathe according to their own rhythm, the rhythm that a harsh childhood once stole away. At the same time, the younger generation, those drowning in the noise of their era, also realize that steadiness is not a privilege reserved for the older generation. It is something they, too, can learn, slowly, little by little, by stopping the chase that has been wearing them down. When they learn to simply stay with themselves for a few minutes, the echoes of life begin to quiet, and a gentle emptiness opens within an emptiness the older generation once called a place to stand firm. Suddenly, between these two generations that seemed so far apart, a beautiful common thread appears. Both are learning what life once took from them. The old are learning how to soften, the young are learning how to steady. The old are learning to speak what they never said. The young are learning to be silent long enough to hear themselves. And as these small pieces begin to come together, we start to see something never seen before. There is no generation that is stronger or weaker. There are only souls finding their way back to themselves. And when each person, in each era, begins to look at one another with empathy instead of judgment, something miraculous happens. The sorrow does not disappear, but it lightens. The wounds do not vanish, but they grow less sharp. The path does not become smooth, but it becomes less lonely. Perhaps this is the transformation we have been seeking all along, not to forget every hurt, but to understand that we can continue walking even while carrying them, not to become someone else, but to return to ourselves a version that knows where the wounds are, and also knows where the light is. And within that realization lies a small but genuine hope, that each person can rewrite the way they live with their own heart, beginning from this very moment, a moment quiet enough for us to hear our inner voice soften. When we look back on the entire journey of a human being, from a childhood marked by scarcity to invisible psychological imprints, generational conflicts, existential paradoxes, and the emotional twilight each of us must pass through, we begin to understand that life never moves in a straight line. It does not take us from point A to point B through a clear, open, orderly path. Instead, it leads us through strange spirals, where each generation carries within it a portion of the untold story of the one before. Those born in the 1,970 seconds may believe they are simply living their own lives, yet in truth, They carry the echoes of a world so harsh, it never allowed them the luxury of fragility. And the young generation today may think they are carving their own way through a world that is too fast, too bright, too loud, without realizing that the slow, steady footsteps of the previous generation silently laid part of the foundation on which they now stand. And in the intersection of those two worlds, those two rhythms, we see a truth that is soft yet deep. Human beings, regardless of the time in which they are born, are all searching for the same thing, a place to belong, a place where they do not have to strain to appear strong, nor hide to protect their vulnerability, a place where they are seen as they are, with no past to prove and no future to chase. Perhaps what connects one human to another is not sameness, but the truth that everyone carries wounds. One generation bears wounds caused by scarcity, another bears wounds caused by excess. One is lonely in silence, the other is lonely in noise. Yet the moment we recognize that another person's sorrow is, in some way, a reflection of our own, the distance that once seemed impossible to cross suddenly becomes smaller. And then we begin to understand. None of us is ever truly complete. We are merely souls continually learning how to heal, continually learning how to rise from what has hurt us, and sometimes simply learning how to sit beside ourselves and say, "I've tried so hard." When we look at the world with gentler eyes, generational conflict stops being a wall and becomes a bridge. The old begin to see that softness does not make them weaker, it makes them more human. The young begin to realize that steadiness is not foreign. It is simply something life has not yet had the chance to teach them. And in that meeting, something beautiful happens. Two souls from two different eras find a shared rhythm, the rhythm of empathy. Perhaps this is the true endpoint of every human story. We are not here to win or lose, to be strong or weak, to prove or to conceal. We are here to learn how to open, to understand that each person is fighting a battle invisible to others, to know that peace is not a destination, but the way we learn to walk more lightly over the roads that once wounded us. And when we see life with that understanding, we realize that every generation, whether 1,970 or 2,000, is simply a traveler learning how to return to the heart of themselves. Return to the truth that no one needs to be perfect to be loved. Return to the quiet gratitude that no matter how uneven the journey has been, we still have the capacity to feel, to care, and to be gentle with the very things that once caused us pain. That is the moment the story closes, but does not end. For from here, each person will write the next chapter in the way their heart has softened, and that alone is already a very beautiful form of peace.